In our lecture on induction, we saw that inductive reasoning always happens against a background of prior theories. When we draw a general conclusion from our data, we use background theories to see whether we have enough data and whether these data are representative. This means that a scientist can never just look at the data alone and draw her conclusions. You will always look at the data from the perspective of the theories you already believe. And this means that science is not purely driven by observation, but that scientists are always guided by, or if you want to say it in a negative way, biased by, a theoretical perspective. There are always some theories that we take for granted and that we do not criticize. That, at least, is the standard story. But the famous 20th century philosopher of science, Karl Popper, thought that that story wasn't true. For Popper, the most important thing about science was precisely that it was always critical, that it never took anything for granted. In fact, according to Popper, scientists are always trying to show that their own theories are false. That is, they are trying to falsify their own theories. And he claimed that that is precisely what distinguishes a real scientist from a fake scientist, a pseudo-scientist. Now, of course, Popper was aware of the fact that you can only do induction if you accept some background theories. But he also wanted to say that scientists don't really accept any theories at all, since they are always critical. So how can we combine those two ideas? Very simply, Popper said, we need to stop claiming that scientists use induction. They don't. Scientists only use deduction, and therefore they never need any background theories. Popper's suggestion is very radical, but also very influential. So in this lecture, we'll explore his view that scientists only use deduction, and we'll see why that view is problematic. Here is an example from one of our previous lectures. I put 25 frogs in the freezer for a week and all of them died. So all frogs die when they are put in the freezer for a week. I claimed in that lecture that this is a kind of reasoning that scientists engage in all the time. We have a limited amount of observations, and then we draw a general conclusion from those observations. In order to do that, we need to use induction. So where, according to Popper, did I go wrong? I went wrong, Popper would say, when I claimed that scientists draw general conclusions from a limited set of observations. Scientists don't draw general conclusions because they are not interested in claiming that any theories are true. Drawing a general conclusion is claiming that a certain theory is true. In this case, that the theory that frogs die when you put them in the freezer is true. But according to Popper, scientists never claim that a theory is true, because they know that there could always be a new observation that shows them to be wrong. Scientists don't even claim that a theory is probable or likely to be true or anything like that. Instead, they are only interested in critically testing theories and showing that they are false. The only conclusion that scientists ever draw are conclusions that a certain theory is wrong. Let's introduce some terminology. An observation that shows that a certain theory is wrong is called a falsification of that theory. So if I put a frog in the freezer and it survives for a week, that would be a falsification of my theory about frogs. Once we have found a falsification, the theory is falsified. And Popper's philosophy, which claims that scientists are always attempting to falsify their own theories, is called falsificationism. Remember that Popper claims that scientists never use induction. They only use deduction. How could he claim that? Well, he can claim that because falsification only seems to need deductive reasoning. Suppose I do have a frog which survives for a week in my freezer. Then I can set up this argument. If all frogs are dead after a week in the freezer is true, then this frog should be dead. This frog is not dead, so all frogs are dead after a week in the freezer is false. this argument is deductive. If the true premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true as well. In general, any argument with the following logical form is a valid deductive argument. If theory T is true, then we should observe O. We do not observe O, so theory T is false. So it seems that Popper is correct in claiming that falsification only needs deductive reasoning. And if he is also correct in claiming that scientists are only interested in falsification, then he will have successfully shown that scientists never use induction. And that in turn would mean that science can be purely driven by observations, without any bias by a prior theoretical perspective. But philosophers of science nowadays are almost unanimous in concluding that Popper was, in fact, wrong. He was wrong when he claimed that scientists are only interested in falsification. After all, just think of your own field of study. Isn't there a lot that scientists in that field claim to know? Scientists claim to know that French descended from Latin, that the Nachtwacht was presented by Rembrandt, that the ancient Egyptians built the pyramid to serve as elaborate grave monuments, and so on. But let's leave that aside and focus on the logic itself. Because if we think about it more deeply, we will be able to see that Popper was also wrong about the logic of falsification. Let's return to our somewhat gruesome example. If all frogs are dead after a week in the freezer is true, then this frog should be dead. This frog is not dead, so all frogs are dead after a week in the freezer is false. And let us look at the first premise, which claims that if the theory is true, we should observe a dead frog. Is that premise true? Well, no. Or rather, it makes a number of assumptions. Suppose, for instance, that some animal lover has taken the frog out of the freezer for a few days and has then put it back just before I came to collect it. Then the theory can be true and we nevertheless see a living frog. Or suppose that the freezer had broken down sometime during the week. Or suppose that this animal is in fact not a frog, but a toad. Then too, seeing a living animal emerge from the freezer would be compatible with the truth of the theory. So a more correct argument would be this. If all frogs are dead after a week in the freezer is true, and nobody took this frog out of the freezer during the week, and the freezer kept working during the entire week, and it's really a frog, then this frog should be dead. Nobody took the frog out of the freezer during the week. The freezer kept working during the entire week. It's really a frog. Therefore, not all frogs are dead after a week in the freezer. But that's a lot more complicated. And not only is it more complicated, but the complications, which I've put in italics in the text, actually form a substantial background theory. So what this example shows us is that in order to falsify a theory, you will need to make a lot of assumptions. But how do you know that those assumptions are true? Well, either because you've used induction, or because you just have uncritically accepted them. In either case, you are not being the hypercritical thinker that Popper wants you to be. Just like you can't do induction without having a background theory, some theoretical perspective that guides your thinking, so you also can't do falsification without having such a background theory, such a theoretical perspective. And that is why philosophers of science have come to the conclusion that Popper's ideas, although they have been very popular among scientists, are not in fact an alternative to the standard story about induction. Because it turns out that we really can't do without induction in science.